The HOA installed illegal spike strips on my private road to force me out. After 20 years of military service, I had finally retired to my family's property in the suburbs. The modest single-story home with its detached garage and a couple of acres of woodland was my sanctuary, a refuge that my grandfather had tended lovingly before me. This land represented my family's legacy and the peace I had craved for years. In the beginning, my days were simple. Each morning started with coffee on the porch, where I would watch the world wake up, followed by tending to the garden, and perhaps catching up on a book that had gathered dust while I served overseas. My life had been one of rigid schedules and endless demands. Now, I valued my privacy and independence more than anything, and I intended to protect it at all costs. That peace was shattered the day Mr. Lane from Cypress Core Industries, CCI, knocked on my door. He was young, suited sharply, with a practiced smile that seemed rehearsed. After a brief introduction, he launched into a pitch about CCI's plans to revitalize the area with new development projects, luxury apartments, and a shopping center. "We're very interested in your property," he said, flashing that smile again. "You're sitting on prime real estate. We're prepared to make you a generous offer." With a firm resolve, I politely declined. "The land has been in my family for generations and is not for sale." His smile faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. Instead of leaving, he handed me a glossy folder filled with information about CCI's proposed developments, along with a written offer of $350,000. I didn't need to think about it. The answer was an emphatic no. It wasn't about the money. Selling the land would feel like betraying my family. My grandfather, my father. CCI's interest piqued my curiosity, though. Why were they so eager to get their hands on my land? It wasn't the only property in the area. What made mine so special? Over the next few weeks, representatives from CCI kept coming by, each time with increasing offers, from $400,000 to $450,000. One woman, Ms. Harlow, even tried to play on my sense of guilt, suggesting how difficult it might be to maintain such a large property alone now that I was retired. Another representative hinted at the rising property taxes I could expect once development began. Each meeting left me firm in my resolve, but their persistence began to plant seeds of unease. Rumors bubbled through the neighborhood, whispers about how CCI had been acquiring properties at an alarming rate, often at prices significantly above market value. Some neighbors speculated they were after untapped resources like natural gas or rare minerals. Others whispered about less savory motives, shady deals, underhanded tactics meant to strong-arm homeowners into selling. Around the same time, the Homeowners Association, HOA, seemed to take a sudden interest in my property. I had always maintained my yard well, keeping the grass trimmed and the fences in good shape. But soon the letters began. "Your lawn exceeds the allowable height specified by HOA guidelines. Please address this promptly." One letter read. Another cited my wooden fence, which had stood firm for decades, claiming it didn't meet updated specifications. Each notice was accompanied by fines and veiled threats of further action if I didn't comply. First, I laughed it off. It felt absurd, as though someone was deliberately nitpicking to annoy me. But the more notices I received, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that it was all interconnected. The timing seemed too convenient. Could CCI be using the HOA as a tool to pressure me into selling? The notion felt far-fetched, but the longer it went on, the more plausible it appeared. The breaking point came when I received a certified letter from the HOA. A compliance officer would be conducting an inspection of my property under the guise of routine procedure. It was unsettling. I could sense the implicit threat. This was designed to wear me down, to make me feel like holding onto my land wasn't worth the trouble. I stood on the porch that evening, looking out over my yard, where I had cultivated peace. Now I felt a deep simmering frustration. This was supposed to be my quiet retirement, not a battlefield. I was being backed into a corner. But if there was one thing the military had taught me, it was to stand my ground, and I wasn't about to give up without a fight. The next morning I made my decision. I was going to do some digging. The information I uncovered only deepened my suspicion. CCI had acquired nearly 40 properties in the surrounding area in just the last 5 years, often paying prices significantly above market value. Many homeowners initially refused to sell but changed their minds after months of pressure from the HOA or sudden financial difficulties. It wasn't just rumors. CCI was systematically targeting properties, playing a long game. But what was their end goal? The development plans they had presented me seemed legitimate on the surface, but something felt off. If they were merely building shopping centers and luxury apartments, why were they willing to go to such lengths to secure every last piece of land? With determination, I began to pay closer attention to the activity in my neighborhood. Trucks emblazoned with CCI's logo drove through the area frequently. They would often stop at properties they had already acquired. Construction crews were a common sight, yet it wasn't always clear what they were working on. And then there were drones. Small, silent machines occasionally buzzed overhead, piquing my curiosity and concern. One morning, a neighbor mentioned seeing a drone hovering over his backyard late at night. It was getting too eerie, and I couldn't help but feel the weight of an unseen surveillance. Meanwhile, the HOA ramped up its campaign against me. They targeted not just my lawns but even the paint on my garage door, claiming it was fading and inconsistent with the community's aesthetic. It didn't take long to notice a pattern. My neighbors were getting away with violations that I was being fined for. A yard down the street had weeds so high they nearly reached the porch, yet no notices arrived for them. A rusting car sat in another neighbor's driveway for months, yet still the HOA didn't act. It became glaringly evident that I was being singled out, and the community was starting to notice too. While some neighbors expressed sympathy at first, I overheard conversations that turned cautious. They speculated about my situation in hushed tones, but as the letters kept piling up, the atmosphere began to shift. Friendly waves turned into evasive gestures. A group of neighbors who'd once chatted cheerfully would fall silent as I walked by, their fear palpable. Then there was Kenneth, the HOA president, a middle-aged man whose self-satisfied demeanor set my teeth on edge. He had always been an irritating presence, but now he seemed to have made it his mission to antagonize me. He showed up at my door unannounced, claiming to conduct routine safety inspections. During the first of these encounters, he pointed out a loose step on my porch, handing me a printed warning notice on the spot. The second time, he strolled the perimeter of my property, muttering about potential hazards while scribbling notes. "This is about more than aesthetics," he noted with a casual air. "We have to think about community safety." His tone was almost friendly, but the unspoken threat loomed large. Kenneth wasn't enforcing rules. He was sending a message. As if that weren't enough, CCI decided to make another move. A new letter arrived, marked with CCI's logo. This time, the offer leapt to $500,000. The revised letter promised to cover all moving expenses and even offered temporary housing during the relocation process. It concluded with a handwritten note from Mr. Lane, reiterating their confidence that this offer would meet my expectations. I tossed the letter into the growing pile of rejected offers. Their ceaseless persistence was disconcerting, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something about my land intrigued them far beyond ordinary development. Days later, trouble arrived in full force. I woke to find my garden devastated, flower beds trampled, soil churned up as if someone deliberately stomped through it. The expense of rose bushes, a gift from my late father, lay uprooted and left to wither in the sun. This wasn't careless destruction. It felt personal. Less than a week passed before I found my mailbox smashed to pieces. The wooden post splintered, the metal box crumpled like an afterthought. Unlike the mess in my garden, this damage felt malicious, purposeful. Someone had gone out of their way to destroy what had always been a sturdy fixture at the end of my driveway. The culmination of these events boiled over into an uncontrollable anger. The harassment from the HOA, relentless offers from CCI, and now blatant acts of vandalism. It was more than I could accept. I began to suspect that the HOA and CCI were actively collaborating, and the evidence felt undeniable. The timing of the harassment formed a pattern too coordinated to ignore, and I felt the pressure intensify. The vandalism further isolated me. Neighbors, once cordial, now seemed wary. Whispers about my misfortunes circulated, and I felt the weight of their silent judgment. I was becoming a pariah in my own community. One evening, sitting on my porch and surveying the wounded remnants of my garden, I wondered if this was all leading to something bigger. CCI's relentless pursuit of my land, the HOA's brazen harassment, and the sudden escalation to property damage all felt like pieces of a puzzle I had yet to fit together. But in dark moments, doubt crept in. Was it worth holding on to this property? The land was my family's legacy, yes, but what was the cost? Was I fighting a battle I couldn't win? The thought churned uncomfortably in my stomach. I quickly shook it off. I had spent my life standing up to bullies, and I wasn't about to stop now. But as I locked the doors that night, checking each window carefully, I couldn't dismiss the growing weight of my situation. I was being backed into a corner, and whoever was behind this wouldn't stop until I broke. They didn't know me, though. I wasn't the type to give in easily. The next morning, as the sun rose over my property, I made a vow. I would not surrender. I would fight back against the onslaught. I had made a vow. I would not surrender. I would fight back against the onslaught. The relentless campaign by CCI and the HOA was meant to intimidate me, but it was now my turn to take action. The games they played had gone too far, and I was no longer just a target. I was determined to turn the tables. The following morning, I sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by a fortress of papers. I gathered every letter from the HOA, every notice of fines, and every offer from CCI. I began cataloging each incident of harassment, creating a timeline that detailed their ceaseless pressure and the growing aggression aimed at me. I pulled out my laptop and began searching for local resources. I found websites dedicated to homeowners' rights, forums where others shared their experiences battling HOAs, and articles outlining how to stand up against corporate overreach. I read everything I could get my hands on and felt my confidence build with each passing hour. Noticing how isolated I had become in my community, I made a decision. I would start reaching out to my neighbors, not just for support, but also to build a coalition against the shared threat. I suspected I wasn't the only homeowner in the neighborhood who felt uneasy about CCI and the HOA's tactics. I crafted a simple flyer outlining my situation and calling for a neighborhood meeting. I printed out several copies and spent the evening placing them in mailboxes, hoping to spark interest and concern among my neighbors. The day of the meeting arrived, and I set up chairs in my living room, feeling a mix of excitement and nerves. As the hour approached, I wondered if anyone would show up. I had invited everyone, sympathetic neighbors and those who had kept their distance. When the doorbell rang, I nearly jumped out of my skin. I opened the door to find a small group of my neighbors, faces I recognized but had barely spoken to in recent weeks. They trickled in slowly, a mix of curiosity and apprehension etched on their faces. After some initial pleasantries, I launched into my story. I recounted the harrowing experiences I had faced, every threatening letter from the HOA, the constant pressure from CCI, and the damage to my property. I spoke of the harassing fines that seemed to accumulate without cause and the suspicion that Kenneth and Ryan were in collusion with CCI. At first, they listened quietly, taking in my words. But as I outlined the connection between the corporate development and the HOA's actions, murmurs of agreement rippled through the group. One neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, spoke up, recounting how she had received a warning about her fence, despite having seen other neighbors get away with far worse violations. Another chimed in with a story about an aggressive representative from CCI attempting to pressure him to sell his land. With each story, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The gathering morphed from a simple meeting into a rallying cry against the pressures we had all faced. With a renewed sense of purpose, we decided to not only stand against the harassment but to protect our community's values and interests together. That night, we established a neighborhood watch group, committed to documenting HOA violations, sharing resources, and supporting one another. I felt the weight of isolation lift just a little as I realized I wasn't alone in this fight. Fueled by my neighbor's support, I took my findings to a lawyer who specialized in homeowners' rights. She listened carefully, her brow furrowing in concern as I laid out the timeline of events and provided the evidence I had collected. With careful analysis, she explained that what I was experiencing wasn't just harassment, it was illegal. "Your case is stronger than you realize," she said. "The HOA has specific rules and regulations. And it appears they have significantly overstepped their bounds, especially if they are colluding with CCI. With her help, we prepared to send a cease and desist letter to the HOA, demanding they halt their harassment immediately. My heart raced as I signed the letter. For the first time I felt empowered, portraying me not as a victim but as a soldier preparing for battle. Weeks turned into months. My resolve solidified with each passing day. Armed with my newfound knowledge and allies, I attended HOA meetings, voicing my concerns publicly. I confronted Kenneth with the evidence I had gathered, my heart thumping wildly in my chest as I laid out the blatant injustices faced by homeowners in our community. Confronting him was electrifying. The room went silent as I spoke, outlining the suspicious activities and connections between the HOA and CCI. I could feel Kenneth's anger radiating as he fumbled for words, his smug facade cracking under the weight of scrutiny. But my community had rallied behind me. More and more neighbors began sharing their own experiences, bolstered by the courage I had found. The tide was shifting. People who had once been afraid now saw a path to justice, and together we stood against the injustice. With the pressure mounting, CCI finally responded with another hefty offer, not just to me but to many homeowners in the area. Their desperation was palpable, with promises of $600,000 now tantalizingly dangled. But we were united. No one took the bait. Instead, we turned to local media, sharing our stories and shining a light on the shady dealings of the HOA and CCI. Coverage exploded, bringing attention to our plight in a way I couldn't have anticipated. The community began to rally. Not just residents but local activists, reporters, and homeowners' rights advocates joined our cause. CCI's tactics were scrutinized under the public eye, and Kenneth's authority began to unravel as more neighbors stepped forward with their grievances. Feeling emboldened by popular support, we organized protests and meetings with local officials. The pressure became unbearable for Kenneth and CCI. Letters arrived from CCI's legal team threatening lawsuits against me for speaking out, but it only emboldened our resolve. We had drawn a line in the sand, and it became clear that the once cozy facade of the HOA was about to crumble. The investigations were launched at the HOA, and neighboring homeowners began documenting their own issues. The climax arrived when a local news team conducted an on-site investigation. With cameras rolling, they confronted Kenneth about the complaints, and as he stuttered through his responses, I knew I had exposed the lie. In that moment, the change in power dynamics was palpable. As the news segment aired, public outrage surged. Homeowners came forward to discuss their experiences, and the tide of the community shifted in unimaginable ways. It didn't take long for Kenneth to face the consequences of his actions. The pressure skyrocketed until he was removed from his position, and an independent investigation was launched into the HOA's dealings. Simultaneously, CCI's executives faced scrutiny. Investors began pulling out. Reports of illegitimate surveillance and harassment surfaced. The collective efforts bore fruit as the community banded together, determining the worth of their legacy and home outweighed the allure of dollars thrown carelessly in their direction. Finally, the storm receded. With the HOA in disarray and CCI on its knees, a semblance of peace returned to my life. I stood on my porch, coffee in hand, watching my neighbors begin to rebuild from what had once felt like total destruction. The love for our community paved paths to healing. In the end, despite the upheaval, I had forged stronger bonds with my neighbors than I ever imagined possible. We talked over fences, laughing and reminiscing about the shared trials that had led us here. The property felt more like home than ever, each patch of earth rich with newfound strength and resilience. United against a common enemy, we had found our voices, and together we had reclaimed not just our homes but our community. My grandfather would have been proud. The legacy of my family shone brightly against the dark backdrop of greed, proving that standing together, we could repel even the most formidable foes. I would never forget those daunting moments that had brought us all to the edge, but I also knew we had turned crisis into catharsis, pain into unity. With a renewed sense of purpose and community, I embraced the journeys ahead, knowing that I was part of something larger, something immensely powerful. As I sipped my coffee, a smile crept onto my face. I had weathered the storm, fought for what was right, and emerged victorious. And as the sun set on another day of this new chapter, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace wash over me. My home was safe and I was finally free.